In the year 1977, Harlem did not sleep the way it once had. The neighborhood rested lightly, like a city holding its breath, aware that something powerful moved through its streets even when nothing appeared to be happening. Neon signs hummed softly above closed storefronts. Streetlights cast long, tired shadows across cracked sidewalks. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, not urgently, but routinely, like a familiar sound that no longer demanded attention. This was Harlem at night, calm on the surface, restless underneath, and at the center of that quiet restlessness stood a man most people never saw, but nearly everyone felt. Nicky Barnes was not loud. He did not stand on corners barking orders or announce his presence with violence for its own sake. His power did not live in spectacle. It lived in silence, in systems, in the invisible lines that connected one street to another, one city to the next, one continent to another. By 1977, Barnes had already become something rare in American crime history, a man who controlled an empire vast enough to challenge the mafia, yet subtle enough to remain largely unseen by the public. To some, he was a myth. To others, a rumor. To law enforcement, he was a growing frustration. To Harlem, he was a shadow king. At night, in carefully chosen apartments with thick curtains and soft lighting, Barnes sat far from the chaos his business produced. There were no piles of cash on tables, no weapons laid out for intimidation. The rooms were quiet, deliberate, controlled. Jazz sometimes played low in the background. Conversations were measured, voices kept calm. Every movement carried intention. Barnes understood something many criminals never did: noise attracts attention, and attention invites endings. Outside, the city continued its slow rhythm. Taxis rolled past, their tires hissing against wet pavement. Couples walked home arm in arm, unaware that the heroin flooding their neighborhood traced back through layers of organization to a single mind. Addicts lingered near abandoned buildings, chasing relief that would never come. Police cruisers passed without stopping. On the surface, it looked like just another night in New York. But beneath it all, an empire functioned with mechanical precision. Barnes had reached a point few ever do. He was wealthy beyond imagination, earning millions each day at the height of his operation. He was insulated by layers of loyal associates, protected by fear, money, and careful planning. He did not touch the drugs himself. He did not involve himself in street-level disputes. His fingerprints were nowhere they could be easily found. From the outside, it appeared as if he had beaten the system, not through brute force, but through intelligence and restraint. Yet power, no matter how carefully managed, carries a weight. And by 1977, that weight was beginning to press down on Barnes in ways even he could not fully control. There was a subtle shift in the air. Conversations paused a second longer than usual. Trusted faces carried new expressions, tightened jaws, eyes that wandered when they should not. Success had brought comfort, but it had also brought visibility. And visibility, even indirect, has a way of drawing consequences. The authorities had not rushed. They had learned to wait. For years, Barnes had existed in a space just beyond their reach, a name spoken in briefings, a target discussed behind closed doors. Every failed case, every collapsed charge, every witness who disappeared or changed their story had taught them patience. They stopped chasing headlines and started building foundations. Wire by wire. Transaction by transaction. Relationship by relationship. What Barnes mistook for safety was, in truth, silence before convergence. Harlem itself was changing too. The old rhythms of the neighborhood, community ties, informal codes of respect, were eroding under the pressure of addiction and fear. Barnes had once believed he could control not just the flow of drugs, but the behavior of those beneath him. But power spreads unevenly. It bends people differently. Greed crept in where discipline once lived. Fear replaced loyalty. And somewhere deep within the structure Barnes built, hairline fractures began to form. What makes Barnes' story unusual is not simply the scale of his empire, but the manner in which it approached its end. There was no dramatic shootout to announce his downfall. No bloody street war that forced his hand. No single mistake that shattered everything overnight. Instead, his fall came quietly, almost politely, like a door closing softly in a room no one realized was emptying. In 1977, Barnes did not wake up thinking this would be the year everything changed. He moved through his days with the same confidence that had carried him through decades of crime. He trusted the systems he had designed. He trusted the people he had elevated. He trusted, above all, his own understanding of power. But the city around him had begun to operate by new rules. The government had new tools. His allies had new fears. And the silence he relied on was no longer his alone. There is something haunting about a king at the height of his reign who does not hear the footsteps approaching behind him. Barnes had mastered the art of control, but control is not permanence. It is a balance, and balance can shift without warning. By the time the shift becomes visible, it is often already too late to correct. As Harlem settled into another restless night, Barnes remained unaware that the story of his empire was entering its final movement. The pieces were already in motion, placed carefully by people who had learned to wait as long as he had. The quiet that once protected him was changing its purpose. It was no longer concealment. It was preparation. And so this story begins not with gunfire or headlines, but with stillness. With a city breathing softly in the dark. With a man who had everything and did not yet know he was about to lose it. The king was still on his throne, but the room had begun to empty, and the silence, so long his ally, was slowly turning against him. Long before the name Nicky Barnes carried weight in whispered conversations, before it inspired fear or respect, there was a boy named Leroy Nicholas Barnes growing up in Harlem at a time when the neighborhood itself was learning how to survive. The Harlem of his childhood was not the glamorous symbol it would later become in music and memory. It was crowded, worn down, and shaped by limitations that pressed in from every direction. For a young boy, the streets were both a playground and a classroom, offering lessons that were rarely gentle and never optional. Barnes was born in 1933, in the long shadow of the Great Depression, into a world where opportunity was unevenly distributed and often entirely absent for black families. His parents did what they could, but stability was fragile. Like many children of that era, Barnes learned early that security could disappear without warning. When his father died, the loss was more than emotional. It created a gap, financial, emotional, and psychological, that never truly closed. His mother struggled to hold the family together, but Harlem was unforgiving, and childhood innocence faded quickly. The neighborhood itself shaped Barnes as much as his home did. Apartment buildings pressed tightly together, hallways echoing with voices and footsteps at all hours. Outside, the streets buzzed with energy, vendors calling out, children darting between stoops, men leaning against brick walls watching everything and saying very little. These men fascinated young Leroy. They seemed untethered by rules, immune to authority, confident in a way that stood in sharp contrast to the exhaustion he saw at home. They did not rush. They did not explain themselves. They appeared to answer to no one. School offered structure, but not belonging. Barnes was intelligent, observant, but restless. He noticed the difference between what teachers promised and what the world delivered. The idea that hard work alone could guarantee a future rang hollow when so many around him worked endlessly and still had nothing to show for it. Authority figures spoke of patience and obedience, but the streets rewarded decisiveness and nerve. Slowly, the streets began to feel more honest. As Barnes grew older, trouble found him not through rebellion, but through curiosity. He watched how money moved through the neighborhood, quietly, informally, outside official channels. Numbers runners passed envelopes with practiced ease. Small-time hustlers lived better than men with steady jobs. Nothing about it felt chaotic. It felt organized. Intentional. Barnes noticed patterns, routines, rules that weren't written down but were strictly enforced. The underworld, he realized, had its own order. By his teenage years, Barnes had begun drifting toward petty crime. Nothing dramatic at first, small thefts, errands for older boys, moments that felt more like tests than crimes. Each success came with a quiet rush, not from danger, but from competence. He was good at it. More importantly, he learned quickly. He listened more than he spoke. He remembered faces, habits, weaknesses. While others chased thrills, Barnes chased understanding. His first arrests did not scare him, they clarified things. Time in reform school introduced him to a different kind of education. There, he met boys from every corner of the city, each with their own story of scarcity and frustration. Some were reckless, some angry, some broken. Barnes remained calm, absorbing lessons others overlooked. He learned what mistakes led to capture, which behaviors attracted attention, and which ones allowed men to operate quietly for years. Confinement, instead of crushing him, refined him. When he returned to Harlem, Barnes was changed. Not hardened in the traditional sense, but sharpened. He no longer saw crime as rebellion. He saw it as a system, one that could be mastered. He began to distance himself from impulsive companions, gravitating instead toward older, more disciplined figures. These men did not brag about their work. They spoke in fragments, in suggestions. They valued patience above all else. From them, Barnes learned the importance of remaining invisible even while exerting influence. Harlem in the 1950s was a place of contradiction. Culture flourished, but poverty persisted. Jazz clubs pulsed with life while addiction crept through alleyways and stairwells. Barnes moved through this environment with growing confidence. He understood the community's vulnerabilities because he had lived them. He also understood its strengths, its pride, its codes, its unspoken rules. This dual understanding would later become one of his greatest advantages. At home, responsibility came early. Barnes learned how to manage scarcity, how to stretch resources, how to remain composed even when circumstances pressed in. These skills translated easily into the criminal world, where emotional control often mattered more than physical strength. He learned to hide ambition behind politeness, to listen without revealing his thoughts, to make himself useful without appearing threatening. People underestimated him, and Barnes quietly encouraged it. There was no single moment when Barnes decided to pursue a life of crime. It unfolded gradually, like a path revealing itself step by step. Each choice felt logical in isolation. Each success reinforced the belief that this world, harsh as it was, operated more honestly than the one that promised fairness and delivered disappointment. Crime did not feel like betrayal, it felt like adaptation. By the time Barnes entered adulthood, Harlem had already shaped him into something precise and deliberate. He was not driven by chaos or rage, but by a calm understanding of how power functioned. He had seen what helplessness looked like and rejected it completely. Control, over money, over time, over circumstance, became his guiding principle. What no one could see yet was how far that principle would take him, or how deeply it would eventually isolate him. For now, Barnes was simply a young man learning how to navigate a world that had offered him few guarantees. He moved quietly, watching, learning, preparing. The crown was nowhere in sight, but the foundation was already being laid, one careful decision at a time. By the time Leroy Barnes reached his late teens, Harlem had already taught him lessons that could not be found in classrooms or books. The streets were patient teachers, and Barnes was an attentive student. He had learned how to observe without drawing attention, how to listen without revealing intent, and how to move through dangerous spaces without appearing dangerous himself. These skills did not make him feared. They made him trusted. And in the underworld, trust often mattered more than reputation. The first crimes Barnes committed were small, almost forgettable in isolation. Running errands for older hustlers, carrying packages he did not ask questions about, watching street corners for brief moments. None of it felt dramatic. There were no guns, no confrontations, no sense of crossing a clear moral line. It felt more like participation in an informal economy that everyone pretended not to see. Money changed hands quietly. Instructions were given in fragments. Mistakes were corrected swiftly but without emotion. Barnes noticed that the men who lasted longest were not the loudest or the most aggressive. They were the ones who understood timing. They arrived early, left early, and never lingered where they did not belong. They dressed plainly, spoke little, and avoided unnecessary conflict. From them, Barnes learned his first unspoken rule: survival favors those who blend in. As his confidence grew, so did his responsibilities. He was trusted with slightly larger tasks, small amounts of money, short trips across neighborhoods. Each successful errand expanded his reputation, not as someone dangerous, but as someone reliable. Barnes took pride in this. He was careful with every detail, knowing that consistency built opportunity. He avoided alcohol, avoided drugs, avoided the kind of behavior that drew attention. While others chased excitement, Barnes chased stability. Inevitably, mistakes came. An arrest here, a confrontation there. These moments did not break him, they refined him. Each interaction with law enforcement became a lesson in what not to do. He learned how officers asked questions, what made them suspicious, how paperwork moved slowly through systems not designed to understand subtlety. He learned that the law relied heavily on patterns, and that breaking patterns could be as effective as breaking laws. Time spent in reform institutions and short stints behind bars further shaped Barnes' outlook. Inside, he observed men who had failed to control their impulses, men who spoke too much, trusted too easily, or acted without thinking ahead. He saw how bravado dissolved under pressure, how loyalty vanished when sentences grew long. Barnes remained quiet, detached, watching everything. He treated confinement not as punishment, but as reconnaissance. Within these institutions, networks formed naturally. Barnes met men who would later become competitors, allies, or cautionary examples. He learned how reputations followed people, how stories grew exaggerated with each retelling. More importantly, he learned how quickly information traveled, and how dangerous it was to be at the center of attention. From these observations, he developed another rule: power is safest when it is invisible. When Barnes returned to Harlem each time, the neighborhood felt both familiar and changed. New faces appeared on corners. Old ones disappeared. The rhythms of the streets evolved, but the underlying logic remained the same. Demand created opportunity. Scarcity created desperation. Barnes began to see how crime mirrored legitimate business more closely than most people realized. Supply chains existed. Territories mattered. Relationships determined access. Gradually, Barnes moved beyond errands and into decision-making. He began suggesting improvements, offering ideas framed as questions rather than commands. Older hustlers noticed his intelligence. He never challenged authority openly. Instead, he made himself indispensable. When something went wrong, Barnes helped fix it. When money went missing, he found the cause. When tensions rose, he suggested calm. This approach earned him respect without envy. One of the most important lessons Barnes absorbed during this period was the value of compartmentalization. He learned to separate people, information, and tasks so that no one ever had the full picture. This not only protected operations, but also protected individuals. If someone was arrested, they could not betray what they did not know. Barnes internalized this structure long before he ever had an empire to protect. The streets also taught Barnes about violence, not through participation, but through observation. He saw how quickly violence escalated situations, how it attracted attention from police and rivals alike. He saw men ruin profitable arrangements because of pride or anger. Barnes concluded that violence was a tool, not a strategy. It should be rare, controlled, and purposeful. Anything else was wasteful. As he matured, Barnes began distancing himself from petty crime altogether. He was no longer interested in quick money or short-term gain. He wanted scale. He wanted systems that functioned without his constant presence. He began studying how money moved through the city, how it flowed from addicts to dealers, from dealers to suppliers, from suppliers to financiers. He noticed bottlenecks, inefficiencies, vulnerabilities. These observations planted the seeds of something much larger. There was a quiet confidence developing within him, though he rarely expressed it. Barnes understood that he was preparing for something, even if he could not yet define it. He sensed that the street-level world was only the beginning, not the destination. Others chased respect through fear. Barnes chased control through understanding. By his early 20s, Barnes had outgrown the role of a minor player. He was known, but not famous. Respected, but not celebrated. This anonymity was intentional. He moved through Harlem like a man with no ambitions, even as his mind worked constantly, organizing, calculating, waiting. The streets had shaped him not into a reckless criminal, but into a patient architect. What Barnes did not yet know was that the lessons he learned during these years, the emphasis on structure, discretion, and emotional control, would soon place him on a collision course with forces far larger than himself. The classroom of the streets had prepared him well, but the next phase of his life would demand something more dangerous than intelligence, the willingness to challenge an entire system and believe he could outthink it. For now, though, he remained in the background, watching Harlem breathe, learning its rhythms, absorbing its rules. The making of a king does not announce itself. It unfolds quietly, one lesson at a time, until the student becomes the architect of something the city has never seen before. By the mid-1950s, Harlem had begun to change in ways that were subtle at first, almost easy to ignore if one did not know where to look. Music still drifted from club doorways late into the night, and laughter still echoed off brick walls, but beneath that familiar rhythm, a quieter current was moving. Heroin was becoming more than a vice. It was becoming a business, structured and expansive, with tendrils stretching far beyond the neighborhood. Leroy Barnes watched this transformation carefully, sensing that this was where the true center of power now lay. Unlike gambling or small hustles, heroin did not rely on chance or impulse. It relied on routine. Addicts needed it every day, sometimes several times a day. That predictability fascinated Barnes. He noticed how money flowed steadily toward those who controlled supply, regardless of police pressure or public outrage. Arrests at the street level barely slowed anything down. New dealers appeared overnight. Demand never disappeared. To Barnes, this was not chaos. It was consistency. At first, his involvement was distant. He did not sell drugs on corners or carry product himself. Instead, he observed. He watched how packages arrived in Harlem, how they were broken down, diluted, and redistributed. He listened to conversations about shipments delayed, about sources drying up, about rival groups undercutting prices. Barnes noticed that many of these operations were inefficient, driven by greed rather than planning. Too many hands touched the product. Too many people knew too much. Too many egos competed for control. What struck Barnes most was who controlled the upper levels of the trade. Italian-American mafia families dominated heroin distribution in New York, operating through long-established international connections. They were disciplined, hierarchical, and ruthless when challenged. Street-level dealers, many of them black and Latino, did the visible work and took the greatest risks, while the real profits flowed upward and outward. Barnes understood this imbalance intimately. It mirrored the larger inequalities he had grown up with, just translated into criminal terms. As he edged closer to the trade, Barnes was cautious. He entered through logistics, not sales. He helped coordinate deliveries, ensured money reached the right hands, resolved disputes quietly before they escalated. He made himself useful in ways that reduced friction rather than creating it. Those above him noticed his calm demeanor, his reliability, his refusal to indulge in excess. Trust came slowly, but it came. Barnes' intelligence lay in his ability to see the whole structure rather than just his place within it. He began mapping the trade in his mind, where the heroin came from, how it moved through cities, how it was transformed into street-level product, and how cash traveled back up the chain. He recognized that the true vulnerability in the system was not at the bottom, but at the points where supply and distribution intersected. Control those intersections, and power followed. As his role expanded, so did his earnings. The money was unlike anything he had known. It arrived steadily, predictably, without the volatility of gambling or theft. Barnes did not spend it recklessly. He reinvested it, spreading it across legitimate fronts, hiding it within the rhythms of ordinary commerce. This discipline set him apart. Many around him succumbed to the temptations of sudden wealth. Barnes remained focused. The deeper he moved into the heroin world, the more he understood its moral complexity. He saw firsthand the damage it caused, the lives unraveling, the families breaking apart, the quiet desperation etched into faces he passed on the street. But Barnes did not view himself as the cause. In his mind, demand existed long before he arrived. If he did not supply it, someone else would. This rationalization allowed him to operate without visible remorse, though the consequences of his work never truly disappeared from his awareness. What truly emboldened Barnes was the realization that the mafia's grip on the trade, while powerful, was not absolute. Their size made them slow. Their traditions limited flexibility. They relied on long-standing arrangements that could be exploited by someone willing to think differently. Barnes began to imagine a future where he did not simply participate in the heroin trade, but reshaped it. This idea did not form overnight. It emerged gradually, nurtured by observation and patience. Barnes began building relationships outside traditional channels. He connected with suppliers willing to bypass established intermediaries. He cultivated distributors who valued efficiency over loyalty to old hierarchies. These moves were risky, but Barnes approached them cautiously, testing each connection before committing fully. Throughout this period, Barnes maintained a low profile. He avoided violence, avoided publicity, avoided any behavior that might draw unwanted attention. To many, he still appeared as just another reliable figure in a vast, anonymous system. But beneath that appearance, he was quietly positioning himself at the center of something far more ambitious. The heroin trade demanded emotional detachment, and Barnes possessed it in abundance. He treated transactions as equations, relationships as variables. This detachment made him effective, but it also isolated him. Trust, once earned, remained conditional. Every partnership carried the possibility of betrayal. Barnes accepted this as the cost of power. He trusted systems more than people. By the time he fully committed himself to heroin distribution, Barnes had already separated himself from the street-level chaos that ensnared so many others. He was no longer chasing opportunity. He was shaping it. The trade offered him not just wealth, but structure, predictability, and scale. It was the first arena in which his long-developing philosophy of control could truly be tested. What Barnes did not yet fully grasp was that heroin carried a different kind of danger. Unlike other crimes, it attracted sustained attention from law enforcement, politicians, and international agencies. Its victims were visible. Its impact was undeniable. Every dollar earned carried with it an invisible clock, counting down toward consequences that could not be indefinitely postponed. Still, in those early years, the future seemed distant. The machinery was working. The money was flowing. And for the first time, Barnes felt he had found the arena where he could truly excel. The taste of power was subtle, not intoxicating, but deeply satisfying. It confirmed what he had long suspected, that he was capable of far more than survival. Heroin did not simply enter Barnes' story as a substance. It entered as a gateway, to influence, to wealth, and eventually, to confrontation with forces that would define the rest of his life. For now, though, it was just the beginning of a rise so quiet and calculated that few realized it was happening at all. As Leroy Barnes' involvement in the heroin trade deepened, a realization settled slowly but firmly in his mind. The structure governing the flow of drugs into New York was powerful, but it was not unbreakable. For decades, Italian-American mafia families had dominated the upper tiers of heroin distribution, enforcing control through tradition, violence, and fear. Their authority was rarely questioned, especially by outsiders. Yet Barnes, observing from the inside, began to see the quiet weaknesses hidden beneath that authority. The mafia's power relied heavily on unwritten rules, codes of respect, ethnic boundaries, and rigid hierarchies that discouraged innovation. These rules had preserved order, but they also created blind spots. Barnes noticed that many decisions were made slowly, constrained by deference to older leadership. Supply chains were efficient, but inflexible. Relationships were inherited rather than earned. To Barnes, this felt outdated, even complacent. He believed that efficiency, not tradition, should determine power. The idea that would eventually define Barnes' rise was simple, yet dangerous: he would operate independently. He would not submit to mafia control or accept a subordinate role within their system. Instead, he would build his own network, leaner, more adaptable, and designed for modern realities. This was not rebellion for its own sake. It was strategy. Barnes believed that if he moved quietly enough, structured carefully enough, he could exist alongside the mafia without provoking open conflict. At first, this independence was subtle. Barnes did not announce his intentions or make dramatic moves. He adjusted supply routes here, rerouted profits there. He tested new partnerships with suppliers willing to bypass traditional intermediaries. Each step was measured, reversible if necessary. Barnes understood that a single miscalculation could attract violent retaliation. Caution became his constant companion. Those around him sensed the shift before they fully understood it. Barnes began insisting on stricter discipline, tighter secrecy. Information was shared on a need-to-know basis. Meetings were brief and purposeful. Anyone who acted impulsively was quietly removed from the inner circle. Barnes' organization began to feel different, more corporate than criminal. This approach unsettled some and impressed others. The mafia, for its part, did not immediately react. Their operations were vast, and Barnes remained one of many figures moving within the city's criminal ecosystem. His lack of public visibility worked in his favor. He did not seek recognition, did not flaunt success, did not challenge authority openly. In many ways, he was invisible. But invisibility has limits, especially when money is involved. As Barnes' independent operation grew more profitable, it began diverting resources and revenue that once flowed through mafia-controlled channels. This shift did not go unnoticed forever. Whispers circulated. Questions were asked. Who was moving this volume without permission? Who was disrupting established routes? The answers, though incomplete, pointed increasingly toward Barnes. What made Barnes particularly dangerous was not his ambition, but his restraint. He avoided the kinds of provocations that typically triggered violent responses. There were no public confrontations, no overt disrespect. Instead, he framed his independence as efficiency rather than defiance. In his mind, if he could make himself useful, even indispensable, conflict could be delayed or avoided altogether. Barnes also understood the importance of alliances beyond ethnicity. He built relationships based on shared interests rather than shared backgrounds. This approach broadened his reach and diversified his network, making it harder for any single group to isolate or control him. It was a direct challenge to the old order, even if it was never stated aloud. The risk, however, was constant. Operating outside mafia protection meant Barnes stood alone if challenged. There would be no powerful families to negotiate on his behalf, no long-standing alliances to shield him. Barnes accepted this risk as the price of autonomy. He trusted his systems more than any external protection. Law enforcement dynamics also played a role in Barnes' thinking. He recognized that the mafia's size made them an obvious target for federal agencies, while smaller, more agile operations could slip through the cracks. By avoiding traditional structures, Barnes hoped to remain below the threshold that triggered full-scale investigations. It was a calculated gamble. Internally, Barnes' organization thrived on discipline. Rules were enforced quietly and consistently. Loyalty was rewarded, but never assumed. Barnes believed that fear alone was unreliable. Respect, he thought, was more sustainable. Those who worked with him knew he valued competence above all else. Mistakes were corrected, not punished theatrically. This approach fostered a culture of efficiency rather than chaos. Still, tension lingered. Every independent move Barnes made existed under the shadow of potential retaliation. The mafia had long memories and little tolerance for perceived threats. Barnes knew that his strategy depended on maintaining balance, growing just fast enough to gain leverage, but not so fast as to provoke immediate confrontation. As time passed, it became clear that Barnes was not merely surviving outside mafia control, he was thriving. His profits grew steadily. His network expanded. His influence spread quietly through Harlem and beyond. What began as a dangerous idea was becoming a reality. Barnes was proving that the heroin trade could be restructured, that power could shift without open warfare. Yet success carried its own dangers. The more Barnes succeeded, the more he disrupted the status quo. The old rules no longer applied, and that unsettled everyone involved, criminals and authorities alike. Barnes had crossed an invisible line, one that could not be uncrossed. He was no longer just another player. He was a challenge. This period marked a turning point. Barnes' decision to break from the mafia monopoly set him on a path that would lead to unprecedented power, and equally unprecedented scrutiny. He had chosen independence over safety, innovation over tradition. The consequences of that choice would ripple outward, shaping not only his own fate, but the future of organized crime in Harlem. For now, though, the gamble appeared to be paying off. Barnes moved through his world with quiet confidence, aware of the risks but undeterred. He had challenged a system that had stood for decades, and he was winning, not with violence, but with patience, structure, and an unwavering belief in his own vision. Once Leroy Barnes proved to himself that independence from the mafia was not only possible but profitable, his thinking shifted from survival to permanence. He understood that operating alone, no matter how carefully, still left him vulnerable. A single arrest, a single betrayal, a single misstep could unravel everything. Power, if it was to last, needed structure larger than one man. It needed redundancy, shared interest, and discipline enforced collectively rather than personally. From this realization, an idea began to take shape, quietly, deliberately, and with extraordinary ambition. Barnes began reaching out to other black drug kingpins who, like him, had grown wealthy but remained constrained by the old order. These were men who controlled territories, commanded loyalty, and understood the business beyond street-level chaos. Many of them shared Barnes' frustration with mafia dominance and the limitations it imposed. Still, approaching them carried risk. Alliances in the criminal world were fragile, and trust was scarce. Barnes moved slowly, initiating conversations framed around mutual benefit rather than rebellion. Meetings were held in neutral spaces, apartments, back rooms, locations chosen for privacy rather than comfort. The tone was calm, almost businesslike. Barnes did not posture or threaten. He listened. He asked questions. He spoke in terms of efficiency, shared protection, and long-term stability. He emphasized that fragmentation weakened everyone, while cooperation could create leverage none of them possessed individually. What Barnes proposed was radical in its simplicity, a council. Not a gang, not a hierarchy dominated by one leader, but a cooperative structure where each member retained control over their territory while adhering to shared rules. Profits would be maximized through coordinated supply, disputes would be resolved internally, and violence would be used sparingly, only when necessary to protect the whole. It was an approach modeled less on street gangs and more on corporate governance. The appeal was immediate, but skepticism lingered. These men had built their own empires through caution and force. Sharing power required trust that did not come easily. Barnes addressed this by designing the council around incentives rather than blind loyalty. Membership offered tangible benefits: better access to supply, reduced risk of conflict, collective defense against external threats. Those who broke the rules would face consequences agreed upon in advance, enforced collectively. Gradually, the idea gained traction. Key figures agreed to participate, recognizing that Barnes' vision offered something new, a chance to reshape the balance of power. As the council formed, Barnes remained careful not to crown himself publicly. Leadership emerged through influence rather than title. His role was that of architect and mediator, guiding the structure without dominating it overtly. Rules were established with precision. Members were forbidden from selling heroin within each other's territories without permission. Violence against council members was strictly prohibited. Disputes were to be brought before the group rather than settled individually. Anyone attracting unnecessary attention from law enforcement would be warned, then isolated if behavior did not change. The emphasis was always on preservation of the whole. This structure transformed the heroin trade in Harlem. Instead of competing factions undercutting each other, prices stabilized. Supply chains became more efficient. Profits increased not through expansion of violence, but through reduction of waste. The council operated quietly, its existence known only to those who needed to know. On the streets, little appeared to change. Corners still functioned. Dealers still came and went. But behind the scenes, a new order had taken hold. Barnes' influence grew naturally within this system. His discipline, foresight, and ability to resolve conflicts without bloodshed earned respect. When disagreements arose, he often served as the voice of reason, steering conversations away from ego and toward outcomes. Others began deferring to his judgment, not because he demanded it, but because it consistently proved effective. The council also provided a buffer against mafia retaliation. By uniting, its members presented a more formidable presence. Any move against one risked provoking many. This collective strength altered calculations on all sides. The mafia could no longer isolate Barnes easily, nor could law enforcement target a single figure and expect the operation to collapse. The structure distributed risk, making it resilient. Barnes was careful, however, not to underestimate the dangers of collective power. Councils, like empires, carried the seeds of their own downfall. Jealousy, ambition, and fear could erode unity over time. To counter this, Barnes emphasized routine communication and transparency within limits. Meetings were regular but concise. Decisions were documented mentally, not on paper. Nothing existed that could be seized or exposed easily. Financial discipline was equally important. Profits were laundered through layers of legitimate businesses, spread across accounts and investments. Barnes encouraged diversification, urging members to think beyond the drug trade. This not only protected wealth, but also created exit options, an idea that few criminals considered seriously. To Barnes, longevity mattered more than dominance. As the council solidified, Barnes began to sense the magnitude of what he had built. This was no longer just a network, it was an institution. It had rules, norms, expectations. It reshaped relationships across the city. Yet Barnes remained cautious. He avoided public displays of leadership. He maintained the illusion that power was shared evenly, even as his influence quietly surpassed that of others. The success of the council did not go entirely unnoticed. Law enforcement began to observe changes: reduced violence, increased efficiency, unexplained financial flows. These anomalies raised questions, but answers were elusive. The council's very discipline made it difficult to penetrate. Its members understood the importance of silence, having seen what chaos brought. For Barnes, this period represented the peak of his strategic genius. He had transformed fragmentation into unity without igniting war. He had created a structure capable of sustaining immense wealth while minimizing risk. The street still whispered his name, but now with a different tone, not just respect, but awe. Yet beneath this success lay an unavoidable truth. The larger and more efficient the system became, the more attention it would eventually attract. No structure, no matter how disciplined, could remain invisible forever. Barnes had built something unprecedented, and history had a way of noticing such things in time. For now, though, the council stood strong. Harlem slept beneath its quiet order, unaware of the invisible architecture shaping its nights. And at the center of it all, Leroy Barnes remained calm, watchful, and deeply aware that power, once achieved, demanded constant vigilance to maintain. By the early 1970s, the transformation was complete. What had once been a careful experiment in cooperation had matured into a vast, disciplined machine, and at its center stood Nicky Barnes, now universally recognized among those who mattered as the undisputed power behind Harlem's heroin trade. The streets themselves gave little indication of his dominance. There were no banners, no declarations, no public ceremonies. Power moved invisibly, carried through routine, habit, and quiet obedience. Barnes' days unfolded with a precision that bordered on ritual. He rose early, dressed impeccably, and moved through his life with deliberate calm. His homes were tasteful but restrained, chosen for privacy rather than extravagance. Jazz often played softly in the background, filling rooms with warmth while conversations remained measured and efficient. Visitors were vetted carefully. Time was managed tightly. Every detail reinforced the sense that nothing here was accidental. Money flowed at a scale few could comprehend. Millions of dollars passed through Barnes' network each week, yet rarely did he touch cash himself. The system had matured beyond that. Funds moved through trusted intermediaries, shell businesses, and investments that blended seamlessly into the city's economic fabric. Restaurants, clubs, real estate holdings, all served as conduits for laundering profits. Barnes understood that visibility was risk, and he structured his wealth to remain quietly embedded rather than conspicuously displayed. Those who worked within the system experienced its efficiency firsthand. Supplies arrived on time. Payments were reliable. Disputes were handled swiftly and discreetly. Violence, when it occurred, was rare and purposeful, sending clear messages without chaos. Barnes' insistence on discipline filtered downward, shaping behavior at every level. The streets were calmer, even as addiction deepened. To outsiders, it seemed contradictory. To Barnes, it was proof that order could exist even in darkness. With power came insulation. Barnes no longer needed to involve himself in daily operations. He delegated extensively, trusting layers of lieutenants to manage territories and logistics. Information reached him distilled, filtered through trusted channels. This distance protected him legally and psychologically. He remained informed without being entangled. Decisions were strategic, not reactive. Yet despite his wealth and control, Barnes did not indulge recklessly. He avoided flamboyant displays that had doomed others before him. No fleet of exotic cars lined his driveway. No public celebrations announced his success. Instead, he invested in art, clothing, and experiences that reflected refinement rather than excess. This restraint reinforced his image as someone who understood the long game. Harlem itself felt the effects of his reign in complex ways. The drug trade continued to devastate families, yet the reduction in turf wars and random violence created a deceptive sense of stability. Community leaders spoke of peace while quietly fearing the invisible hand guiding it. Barnes was rarely mentioned by name, but his influence lingered in every unspoken rule, every sudden resolution to conflicts that might otherwise have turned bloody. Within the council, Barnes' authority solidified. Others deferred to him not because he demanded it, but because his judgment consistently protected profits and minimized risk. He became the final arbiter in disputes, the strategist consulted before major decisions. The balance of power tilted subtly but unmistakably in his favor. Without ever declaring himself king, Barnes had become one. Law enforcement remained aware of him, but frustrated. Investigations stalled. Witnesses disappeared or refused to cooperate. Paper trails led nowhere. Barnes' distance from street-level crime insulated him from direct evidence. He seemed untouchable, a figure always just beyond reach. This reputation emboldened him, though he rarely acknowledged it aloud. Privately, however, Barnes was not entirely at ease. Power brought not peace, but vigilance. He trusted systems more than people, yet systems required constant maintenance. A single weak link could expose everything. Barnes monitored his organization carefully, watching for signs of greed, impatience, or fear. Loyalty was never assumed. It was tested continually through behavior rather than words. The isolation of leadership weighed on him. Few people could speak to Barnes as an equal. Conversations were polite, respectful, but rarely candid. He had achieved what he once sought, control over his circumstances, but at the cost of genuine connection. The rooms he occupied were quiet, not because they were empty, but because no one dared fill them with unnecessary noise. Despite these internal tensions, Barnes believed he had achieved a kind of balance. The system worked. The money flowed. The streets remained relatively calm. He had challenged the old order and succeeded. The mafia, while still powerful, had adapted rather than retaliated outright. Coexistence, though uneasy, persisted. Yet success has a way of distorting perception. The longer Barnes remained untouched, the more the boundaries between caution and confidence blurred. He began to believe not just that his system was effective, but that it was invincible. This belief did not manifest as arrogance, but as subtle relaxation, slightly broader reach, slightly higher visibility, slightly greater risk tolerance. Meanwhile, outside his carefully controlled world, forces were shifting. Law enforcement agencies were evolving, adopting new strategies, sharing information across jurisdictions. The federal government was becoming more aggressive in its pursuit of organized crime, particularly drug trafficking. The same patience Barnes had exercised was now being mirrored by those determined to dismantle his empire. Barnes could not see the full scope of this shift. From his vantage point, everything appeared stable. The quiet nights, the steady income, the disciplined operation, all suggested permanence. Yet permanence is an illusion, especially in worlds built on secrecy. The very scale of Barnes' success ensured that it could not remain hidden forever. For now, though, Harlem slept beneath his unseen crown. Nicky Barnes sat at the apex of a system designed for longevity, surrounded by wealth, insulated by structure, and confident in his control. He had become what few ever managed to become, a king without a throne, ruling an empire that existed mostly in the shadows. And in those shadows, the first faint outlines of his eventual fall were beginning to take shape, unnoticed, waiting patiently for their moment. For years, Nicky Barnes existed as a name spoken in low tones within law enforcement offices, a presence felt more than seen. Investigators knew his influence stretched across Harlem and beyond, yet whenever they reached for him, their hands closed on air. Arrests were made at lower levels. Dealers were swept up, couriers detained, middlemen questioned. But Barnes himself remained distant, insulated by layers of structure and silence. The absence of direct evidence frustrated even the most experienced agents. In the early days, law enforcement approached Barnes the same way they had approached others before him, through visible street crime. Patrol officers watched corners, vice squads made arrests, informants were pressured into cooperation. These methods produced results, but not the ones investigators hoped for. Each arrest seemed to change nothing. New faces replaced old ones overnight. The flow of heroin remained steady. The system absorbed losses without disruption. Gradually, a realization took hold within federal agencies. They were dealing not with a loose criminal network, but with an organized enterprise designed to withstand attrition. Barnes' distance from daily operations was not accidental. It was strategic. To reach him, investigators would have to rethink their approach. This would not be a chase. It would be a siege. The shift in strategy was slow and deliberate. Agents began to map relationships rather than transactions. They studied patterns of association, movement, and communication. Surveillance replaced raids. Observation replaced confrontation. Barnes' world was watched patiently, often for months at a time, without intervention. The goal was no longer to disrupt, but to understand. Harlem became a living diagram in the minds of investigators. Who met with whom? When? Where? How often? Patterns emerged, subtle but persistent. Certain individuals appeared repeatedly at the edges of multiple operations. Money flowed in predictable arcs. The same vehicles appeared in different neighborhoods at telling intervals. None of it was illegal on its own, but together, it suggested coordination. Wiretaps became a central tool, though they were difficult to obtain and even harder to interpret. Barnes and his associates spoke in coded language, referencing mundane details that concealed deeper meaning. Conversations about dinners, errands, and travel masked discussions of shipments and payments. Investigators listened for hours, days, weeks, learning the rhythm of these exchanges. Over time, they began to understand the language of the operation. Patience became the defining trait of the investigation. Agents resisted the urge to act prematurely. They knew that early arrests would only strengthen Barnes' defenses. Instead, they allowed the system to continue functioning, documenting its operations meticulously. Each piece of information was catalogued, cross-referenced, and preserved. The case grew slowly, like a structure built one brick at a time. This approach required restraint, both professional and emotional. Investigators watched as drugs continued to devastate communities they were sworn to protect. They attended funerals, spoke with grieving families, and returned to offices where progress felt abstract and distant. The decision to wait was not made lightly. It was a calculation rooted in the belief that dismantling the system required reaching its center. Barnes remained unaware of the full scope of this surveillance. He knew law enforcement was present, it always was. But the absence of direct pressure reinforced his sense of security. Investigations came and went. Names appeared in newspapers, then disappeared. He interpreted the quiet as confirmation that his precautions were working. Within law enforcement, Barnes became a test of institutional patience. Younger agents grew frustrated, eager to make arrests. Veterans counseled restraint, reminding them that the most significant cases often unfolded over years, not months. Barnes' operation, they believed, was too sophisticated to be rushed. Gradually, informants began to emerge, not through coercion, but through circumstance. Some were motivated by fear, others by self-interest. A few were simply tired. These individuals provided fragments of insight rather than complete pictures. Each fragment was valuable, but none were decisive on their own. Investigators learned to piece together partial truths, verifying each against independent sources. Financial analysis became another critical avenue. Accountants and analysts followed money trails that wound through legitimate businesses and shell corporations. Transactions that appeared lawful on the surface revealed inconsistencies when examined closely. Patterns of cash flow suggested laundering on a massive scale. This evidence, while circumstantial, strengthened the broader narrative. As the case grew, so did the circle of those aware of it. Federal prosecutors were brought in, consulted quietly. Discussions turned toward long-term strategy, what charges might hold, which evidence would be admissible, how to protect witnesses. The complexity of the case demanded coordination across agencies, a rarity at the time. All the while, Barnes continued his life largely undisturbed. He attended meetings, managed investments, and maintained his carefully controlled routine. The city moved around him, unaware that his world was being documented in minute detail. The distance between perception and reality widened. The investigation was not without setbacks. Leads dried up. Informants recanted. Evidence that seemed promising proved inadmissible. Each obstacle tested resolve. But the investigators persisted, guided by the belief that Barnes' very success would eventually expose him. Large systems, no matter how disciplined, leave traces. By the mid-1970s, the tide had begun to shift. The accumulated weight of evidence formed a coherent picture. Names connected to names. Events aligned. The outline of the council became visible, even if its inner workings remained partially obscured. Barnes was no longer just a shadow. He was a node, a central point in a vast network. Still, the moment to act had not yet arrived. Premature movement could collapse years of work. Investigators waited, refining their case, anticipating Barnes' next moves. They understood that timing was everything. When they struck, it would have to be decisive. For Barnes, the silence continued to feel protective. For law enforcement, it was the calm before convergence. The city slept, unaware that two forms of patience were approaching their limit, one born of confidence, the other of determination. When those forces finally collided, the outcome would reshape Harlem's underworld forever. By the time Nicky Barnes reached what many would later recognize as the final phase of his ascent, the very habits that had once protected him began to work subtly against him. There was no sudden change, no dramatic shift in behavior that announced danger. Instead, it unfolded gradually, almost imperceptibly, as comfort settled in and vigilance softened at the edges. Barnes still believed deeply in discipline and restraint, but success had altered the landscape around him, making certain risks feel distant, theoretical, manageable. Wealth, when accumulated quietly for long enough, begins to demand expression. Barnes resisted excess more than most, yet even his version of moderation carried weight. He lived in spacious apartments adorned with fine art, furniture chosen for elegance rather than necessity. His clothing was tailored, expensive, unmistakably refined. To those who knew what to look for, these were signals. Not of street-level crime, but of money moving at a scale that required explanation. Unlike flashy gangsters who drew attention through spectacle, Barnes' visibility was subtler and therefore more dangerous. He appeared legitimate. He moved in circles that intersected with business owners, professionals, and cultural figures. His lifestyle suggested success without obvious source, which in itself became a question mark. Law enforcement analysts understood this well. They had learned that the most dangerous figures were often those who blended in seamlessly. As Barnes expanded his investments, the financial footprint of his empire grew more complex. Money flowed through restaurants, clubs, real estate ventures, and shell companies designed to obscure origins. These mechanisms worked effectively for years, but scale introduced vulnerability. Large sums required frequent movement. Frequent movement created patterns. Patterns, once identified, could be studied. Accountants within federal agencies began noticing anomalies, businesses reporting profits inconsistent with location or traffic, properties purchased with cash that defied conventional income models. None of this was proof of criminal activity on its own. But combined with surveillance data and informant testimony, it added depth to a growing picture. Barnes remained confident in his insulation. He trusted his accountants, his lawyers, his intermediaries. He believed the distance between himself and street-level crime was sufficient to shield him. And in many ways, he was right. Direct evidence remained elusive. But the investigation was no longer focused on catching him with drugs or weapons. It was shifting towards something more patient and precise. Visibility also altered dynamics within Barnes' organization. Success breeds ambition, and ambition invites mistakes. Some associates grew careless, emboldened by the belief that the system was untouchable. Others sought recognition, craving status that Barnes deliberately avoided. Small acts of self-indulgence, luxury purchases, public appearances, loose talk, created ripples that reached beyond the inner circle. Barnes noticed these behaviors and corrected them when possible, but the system had grown large enough that control was no longer absolute. Enforcement relied increasingly on trust, and trust, once stretched too thin, became fragile. The very scale that generated immense wealth also reduced Barnes' ability to monitor every detail. Law enforcement, observing from a distance, recognized this phase well. Many large criminal enterprises began to unravel not through violence or betrayal, but through excess. The accumulation of assets created leverage. Seizures, asset forfeiture laws, and conspiracy statutes offered new avenues for prosecution. Barnes' lifestyle, while restrained by criminal standards, provided the material foundation for such strategies. At the same time, the media landscape was changing. Journalists began paying closer attention to the drug trade's upper echelons. Names circulated more freely. Barnes' name appeared occasionally in articles, not always tied to concrete allegations, but increasingly associated with power and influence. Each mention eroded anonymity just a little more. Barnes dismissed much of this as noise. He had lived with rumors for years. Yet even he sensed a subtle tightening, an increase in scrutiny that felt different from before. Meetings were occasionally interrupted. Familiar routes felt watched. Associates reported questions from people who should not have been asking them. None of it was definitive, but together it formed an unease that Barnes found difficult to articulate. The greatest danger, however, lay not in external pressure but in perception. Barnes had begun to see himself not just as a survivor, but as a permanent fixture. The empire had lasted longer than most. It had weathered challenges that destroyed others. This endurance fostered a quiet belief that the system was fundamentally sound, that problems could always be managed as they arose. This belief did not make Barnes reckless, but it did make him less inclined to retreat. Opportunities that once would have been declined were now considered. Expansion felt logical. Consolidation felt necessary. Each decision made sense within the framework of continued success, yet each added another thread to a web that was already under examination. Law enforcement understood that this was the window they had been waiting for. The opulence was not gaudy, but it was sufficient. The financial complexity was not sloppy, but it was traceable. The organization was disciplined, but it was large. And large systems, no matter how careful, generate friction. Investigators focused increasingly on assets rather than actions. They cataloged properties, businesses, accounts. They documented lifestyle discrepancies. They prepared to argue not what Barnes had done on any given day, but what kind of life he lived, and how that life could not be explained legitimately. It was a quieter form of attack, but potentially devastating. Barnes, for all his intelligence, could not see the full shape of this threat. He had mastered evasion in a world defined by street-level enforcement. Now he faced a different kind of scrutiny, one that moved slowly and spoke in numbers rather than threats. The danger was not immediate, and that made it easier to underestimate. As the year moved forward, Barnes continued to live with confidence, surrounded by the comforts his success had earned. The empire still functioned. The money still flowed. The streets remained relatively calm. On the surface, nothing appeared to be changing. But beneath that surface, the very markers of his success were being transformed into instruments of his undoing. The art on his walls, the properties in his name, the businesses he controlled, all were becoming evidence. The trap was not snapping shut. It was closing gradually, quietly, almost politely, until one day Barnes would realize that there was nowhere left to step without leaving a trace. The morning it finally happened did not feel extraordinary. There were no sirens screaming through Harlem, no dramatic confrontations in the street, no sudden eruption of violence to announce that an era was ending. The city woke as it always did, carrying on with its routines, unaware that a quiet turning point had arrived. This was fitting, in a way. Nicky Barnes' rise had been defined by silence and patience, and his fall would follow the same pattern. For Barnes, the day began like many others. Familiar spaces, familiar movements, a life shaped by habit and control. If there was tension in the air, it was subtle enough to be dismissed. He had lived under scrutiny for years. Law enforcement attention was not new. Investigations had come close before and then drifted away. Experience had taught him that pressure did not always mean danger. But this time, the pressure did not ease. When agents arrived, they did so with efficiency rather than force. Warrants were executed calmly, professionally. Doors were opened. Names were spoken. Barnes was taken into custody without resistance. There was no need for it. He understood immediately what this meant. Years of distance, discipline, and calculation had not prevented this moment. They had only delayed it. As he was processed, Barnes maintained composure. Those who encountered him that day later remarked on his calm, on the absence of panic or anger. He asked few questions. He listened. He understood that whatever was happening had been in motion long before that morning. This was not a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a conversation. This was convergence. News spread quickly within certain circles and slowly everywhere else. For many on the street, Barnes' arrest came as a shock. He had seemed untouchable, more rumor than man. For law enforcement, it was the culmination of years of work. For Barnes himself, it was the moment when abstraction became reality. The charges were sweeping. Conspiracy, narcotics trafficking, continuing criminal enterprise. The language was clinical, legal, stripped of drama. Yet behind each word lay years of surveillance, analysis, and quiet accumulation. The case was not built around a single act, but around a life structured to profit from illegality while avoiding direct exposure. Prosecutors understood that this distinction would be central to the trial. Barnes' legal team moved quickly, assembling a defense grounded in the very distance that had protected him for so long. They argued lack of direct involvement, absence of physical evidence, reliance on unreliable witnesses. Barnes, they maintained, was being prosecuted for association rather than action. It was a strategy that had succeeded for others in the past. The courtroom became the new arena where Barnes' fate would be decided. Gone were the private rooms and controlled conversations. Here, everything unfolded under scrutiny. Testimony replaced whispers. Documents replaced coded language. The discipline Barnes had cultivated now served him in a different way. He sat quietly, attentive, rarely reacting. Witnesses took the stand one by one. Some spoke cautiously, their voices measured. Others spoke with visible tension, aware of the consequences of their words. Informants described structures, meetings, routines. Financial experts presented charts and analyses that translated complexity into clarity. The prosecution did not rush. They allowed the story to unfold slowly, methodically, trusting the accumulation of detail to do its work. For the jury, the challenge was not understanding what had happened on any given day, but grasping the scope of the system. They were asked to see Barnes not as a man who sold drugs on a corner, but as an architect of an enterprise that operated continuously, efficiently, and profitably. The prosecution emphasized patterns, consistency, and benefit. Barnes' wealth, his insulation, his authority, all were presented as outcomes of deliberate design. The defense countered with doubt. They questioned motives, credibility, interpretation. They highlighted the absence of direct orders, the lack of recordings where Barnes explicitly instructed criminal acts. Barnes' calm presence reinforced their argument. He did not appear reckless or violent. He appeared controlled, thoughtful, almost ordinary. As the trial progressed, tension built quietly. Observers sensed that this was not a case that would turn on a single moment, but on whether the jury accepted a broader definition of responsibility. Was Barnes responsible for actions he did not personally carry out, but from which he clearly benefited? Was distance a shield, or evidence of intent? Barnes himself remained largely silent throughout. Those close to him later suggested that he understood the gravity of the situation fully. This was not a misunderstanding or an overreach. This was the logical endpoint of a life spent managing risk rather than eliminating it. When the verdict came, it arrived without ceremony. Guilty. The words carried immense weight, yet were spoken plainly, as if acknowledging something inevitable. Barnes absorbed the decision without visible reaction. There was no outburst, no collapse. Only a quiet acceptance that the system he had built was now being used against him. Sentencing followed, and with it, finality. The punishment was severe, reflecting not only the crimes themselves but the scale of the operation. The years stretched far into the future, effectively removing Barnes from the world he had once controlled. The king was not executed, not publicly humiliated, but erased from the game he had mastered. As Barnes was led away, there was no applause, no sense of triumph in the room. Even among prosecutors, the mood was restrained. They understood that this was not a victory over chaos, but the end of a long contest between patience and patience. One had simply outlasted the other. Outside the courtroom, life continued. Harlem remained. The streets adjusted. New players emerged. Systems adapted. Barnes' removal did not end the drug trade or heal the damage it had caused. But it marked the end of a particular way of operating, a reminder that even the quietest empires leave traces. For Barnes, the silence that had once protected him now closed in completely. The world he had shaped no longer needed him. The structures he designed would continue, altered and diminished, while he entered a new existence defined by walls, schedules, and time measured differently. The fall had come not with fire, but with paperwork. Not with chaos, but with procedure. A king had been dethroned not by force, but by patience. And in that quiet conclusion lay the most striking truth of Nicky Barnes' story, that the greatest power he ever wielded could not ultimately shield him from the slow, relentless gravity of consequence. The transition from absolute control to absolute confinement happened with disorienting speed. One day, Nicky Barnes had been surrounded by layers of insulation, trusted intermediaries, controlled environments, the freedom to move as he pleased. The next, his world was reduced to concrete, steel, and routine. Prison did not announce itself dramatically. It revealed itself through repetition, through the slow erosion of choice. Every movement was scheduled. Every interaction was monitored. Power, once invisible and expansive, became irrelevant. Barnes entered the prison system with a reputation that preceded him. Guards knew his name. Inmates whispered it. Some regarded him with respect, others with curiosity, and a few with quiet resentment. Yet reputation, Barnes quickly learned, functioned differently behind walls. It could not buy freedom, nor could it alter the unyielding structure of incarceration. At best, it offered a fragile kind of distance. The early days were marked by adjustment rather than shock. Barnes had always been disciplined, and that discipline now served him in unexpected ways. He adapted to routines quickly, observing rules, noting patterns, understanding the informal codes that governed life inside. He spoke little, watched carefully, and avoided unnecessary conflict. Survival in prison, he understood, required many of the same principles that had guided his life on the streets: patience, discretion, and control of emotion. What prison stripped away most effectively was influence. On the outside, Barnes' decisions rippled outward, shaping outcomes far beyond his immediate reach. Inside, his reach ended at the bars. Messages from the outside world arrived sporadically, filtered through lawyers or monitored correspondence. Each letter, each update, reminded him how little control he now possessed. The empire he had built was continuing without him, but no longer under his direction. At first, Barnes believed he might retain some measure of influence. Long-standing relationships, shared history, and mutual interests suggested that his voice might still carry weight. But as weeks turned into months, it became clear that distance eroded authority. New leaders emerged. Old alliances shifted. Decisions were made without consulting him. The system he had designed for resilience was functioning as intended, without reliance on a single individual. This realization was both a testament to his strategic success and a profound personal loss. Barnes had sought permanence, and he had achieved it. But permanence, he now saw, did not include him. The machine moved on, indifferent to its architect. Isolation deepened this understanding. Prison offered little distraction from thought. Long hours stretched out, filled with routine and reflection. Barnes replayed decisions in his mind, not with regret exactly, but with analysis. He considered where his calculations had held and where they had failed. He recognized that no amount of discipline could completely erase risk, especially as systems grew larger and more visible. Interactions with other inmates were cautious and limited. Barnes did not seek to assert dominance or recreate his former role. He understood that prison hierarchies were volatile and often built on displays of aggression he had long avoided. Instead, he kept to himself, reading, thinking, observing. Some inmates approached him with questions, seeking insight or validation. Barnes offered little. He had learned the cost of words spoken too freely. Guards, too, treated him differently over time. Initial wariness gave way to routine professionalism. Barnes complied with rules, avoided trouble, and gave no cause for confrontation. In a place defined by constant tension, his calm stood out. It did not grant him privileges, but it reduced friction. This, too, was a form of adaptation. As years passed, the weight of time became Barnes' constant companion. On the outside, time had been a resource to manage, a variable to exploit. Inside, time was something to endure. Days blurred together, marked only by meals, counts, and occasional disruptions. The future stretched long and uncertain. News from the outside world arrived sporadically, often distorted by distance and rumor. Barnes learned of arrests, shifts in the drug trade, changes in law enforcement tactics. He watched from afar as the landscape he once navigated with ease evolved beyond his influence. New technologies emerged. New players rose. The world did not pause for his absence. Perhaps the most difficult adjustment was the loss of identity. For decades, Barnes had defined himself through control, through the ability to shape outcomes. In prison, those metrics no longer applied. He was no longer a king, nor even a participant. He was an observer, a number within a system that did not recognize past achievements. This loss did not manifest as despair, but as quiet reckoning. Barnes was not a man given to outward displays of emotion. He accepted reality as it presented itself. Yet beneath that acceptance lay an awareness that the life he had built, for all its discipline and intelligence, had led inevitably to this point. Prison also forced Barnes to confront the human cost of his actions in ways he had long avoided. He encountered men broken by addiction, by violence, by cycles of crime that offered no exit. Some recognized him. Others did not. But the shared environment stripped away distance, making abstraction impossible. The consequences of the drug trade were no longer statistics or distant images. They were present, immediate, and unavoidable. Still, Barnes did not indulge in self-reproach. Reflection, for him, was analytical rather than emotional. He considered cause and effect, structure and outcome. He understood that he had made choices, and those choices had consequences. Prison was one of them. As the years continued, Barnes' role shifted further inward. He became a man defined not by action, but by endurance. The silence that once protected him now enveloped him completely. There were no meetings, no negotiations, no decisions that shaped the outside world. Only time, moving forward relentlessly. In this environment, Barnes began to understand the final irony of his life's work. He had built a system designed to function without chaos, without dependence on any single figure. And it was functioning perfectly. He was unnecessary. The king had fallen not into chaos, but into irrelevance. And in that quiet, controlled confinement, Nicky Barnes confronted the true cost of the empire he had built, an empire that survived him, even as he disappeared behind walls that did not remember his name. Time in prison does not move the way it does outside. It stretches, folds back on itself, and lingers in ways that force the mind to revisit thoughts it once kept buried. For Nicky Barnes, this slow passage became the environment in which his most consequential decision would form. It did not arrive suddenly, nor did it feel dramatic. It emerged quietly, shaped by isolation, reflection, and a growing awareness that the world he had once commanded no longer existed in any meaningful way. At first, Barnes held to the belief that his silence still mattered. The old code, never cooperate, never speak, had been ingrained deeply, reinforced by years of survival and success. He understood the consequences of betrayal in the abstract, even now. Cooperation meant severing himself completely from the identity he had lived by. It meant crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. For a long time, that line remained firm. But prison has a way of stripping away abstractions. As months became years, Barnes watched the gradual erosion of his former influence. Letters slowed, then stopped. Familiar names appeared less frequently, replaced by rumors of arrests, defections, or disappearances. The organization he had built adapted efficiently, just as he had designed it to. It did not need him. And more importantly, it did not protect him. The turning point did not come from pressure applied by authorities alone. It came from betrayal that cut closer to the bone. Barnes learned that those he had trusted most, men who had benefited immensely from his leadership, had begun cooperating themselves. Information he had guarded carefully was being traded for reduced sentences and protection. The code he had honored was dissolving without him. This realization altered the moral calculus entirely. Silence, once a shield, now felt like a one-sided sacrifice. Barnes began to see that loyalty, in the world he had built, had always been conditional. It had lasted only as long as power flowed in his direction. Once that power was gone, so too was the protection it afforded. Federal agents, sensing the shift, approached Barnes with patience rather than threats. They did not rush him. They presented facts, names, timelines, outcomes. They demonstrated that they already knew much of what he had once believed was secret. What they sought from him was not confirmation of the obvious, but clarity, structure, and completeness. Barnes listened. He asked questions. He did not respond immediately. He needed time to understand what cooperation would truly mean. This was not about shaving years off a sentence alone. It was about redefining his relationship to his own past. When Barnes finally agreed to talk, it was not an emotional surrender. It was a calculated decision rooted in realism. He understood that the system he had built was already unraveling. His silence would not preserve it. His cooperation, however, could reshape the narrative, both for law enforcement and for himself. What followed was unprecedented. Barnes did not offer fragments or half-truths. He provided a comprehensive account of the council, its members, its operations, and its methods. He explained the logic behind decisions, the enforcement of rules, the flow of money and power. His testimony was not fueled by vengeance alone, though betrayal had sharpened his resolve. It was fueled by a desire to reclaim agency in a situation where agency had been stripped away. For investigators and prosecutors, Barnes' cooperation was transformative. The information he provided filled gaps that years of surveillance had not fully resolved. Names that had hovered at the edges of cases were now placed firmly at the center. Structures that had been inferred were now confirmed. The scope of the enterprise became unmistakable. Barnes' cooperation also sent shockwaves through Harlem's underworld. Word spread quickly, though details remained murky. A man once considered untouchable had chosen to speak. The psychological impact was profound. Trust eroded rapidly. Alliances fractured. Those who had relied on Barnes' silence now faced the consequences of their own decisions. Within prison, Barnes' status changed overnight. He became isolated, not through official punishment, but through the invisible boundaries inmates enforce among themselves. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Familiar faces turned away. He accepted this without complaint. He had anticipated it. Cooperation had a cost, and he was prepared to pay it. Despite the danger inherent in his decision, Barnes remained composed. He entered witness protection arrangements with the same discipline he had once applied to running an empire. He followed instructions, limited contact, and adapted to new routines. The skills that had once made him powerful now made him an effective informant. In his testimony, Barnes did not embellish. He did not seek to portray himself as a victim or a hero. He spoke clinically, describing actions and outcomes with detachment. This tone lent credibility to his words. He was not seeking redemption. He was providing information. The irony of the moment was not lost on him. For years, he had avoided attention, believing invisibility was the key to survival. Now, his voice was shaping cases, influencing outcomes far beyond his reach. He had traded one form of power for another, less visible, but no less consequential. As cases moved forward based on his testimony, Barnes watched from a distance. Arrests followed. Sentences were handed down. The council collapsed piece by piece, dismantled not through violence, but through exposure. The system he had built so carefully was being taken apart with the same methodical patience that had once sustained it. Barnes' decision to cooperate marked the true end of his reign. Not because it destroyed his empire, that had already begun, but because it severed his final tie to the identity he had lived by. He was no longer a king, no longer even a participant in the world he had dominated. He was a witness, a source, a man whose past had become evidence. In choosing to speak, Barnes reclaimed control over one thing that prison could not take from him, the ability to decide how his story would end. Whether that choice was driven by survival, revenge, or clarity mattered less than its impact. The silence that had once defined his power was broken, and in its place emerged a voice that would echo far beyond the walls that confined him. The king had not gone down fighting. He had gone down explaining. And in the quiet rooms where his words were recorded and transcribed, the final architecture of his empire was laid bare, not by enemies, but by the man who had built it himself. The consequences of Nicky Barnes' decision to cooperate unfolded slowly at first, then all at once. Like a structure weakened at its core, the network he had once built with such care began to collapse not through dramatic explosions, but through a series of controlled implosions. Each arrest, each indictment, each quiet plea agreement sent ripples outward, unsettling a world that had long depended on predictability and silence. For those still operating on the streets, the initial signs were subtle. Familiar faces failed to appear at meetings. Shipments were delayed without explanation. Money that once moved reliably began to stall. At first, these disruptions were dismissed as temporary setbacks, nothing unusual in a business long accustomed to pressure. But as days passed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Something fundamental had changed. Law enforcement moved deliberately, guided by the detailed knowledge Barnes had provided. They did not sweep indiscriminately. They targeted key figures, those whose removal would create maximum instability with minimal noise. Arrests were timed carefully, often coordinated across jurisdictions to prevent warning from spreading. The goal was not spectacle, but dismantling. One by one, members of the council were taken into custody. Some were arrested quietly at home. Others were intercepted during routine movements. The absence of violence was striking. There were no standoffs, no last stands. Many understood immediately what was happening. Resistance would change nothing. The silence that had once protected them now worked against them. For some, Barnes' cooperation came as a betrayal too deep to comprehend. He had been the architect, the stabilizing force, the man whose judgment had shaped their fortunes. To learn that he had spoken, had explained everything, felt unreal. Others, however, were less surprised. They had sensed the erosion of loyalty long before it became public. Barnes' decision merely confirmed what they had already feared, that the code they lived by was conditional, and when pressure mounted, it dissolved. Within the organization, panic spread unevenly. Some scrambled to protect themselves, destroying records, moving money, severing ties. Others sought their own deals, approaching authorities in hopes of reducing sentences. The very discipline that had once unified the council now fractured under stress. Trust vanished. Every conversation became suspect. Silence, once a shared asset, became a liability. Harlem felt the effects quickly. The drug trade did not disappear, but it destabilized. Power vacuums emerged as leaders were removed. Smaller groups attempted to assert control, often without the discipline Barnes had enforced. Violence increased in some areas, as disputes that would once have been mediated internally now spilled into the open. The illusion of order faded. For law enforcement, the period following Barnes' cooperation was intense and unrelenting. Courtrooms filled with cases rooted in his testimony. Prosecutors presented evidence that traced entire supply chains, exposing relationships that had operated for years in secrecy. Judges, confronted with the scope of the enterprise, handed down sentences that reflected not just individual crimes, but collective impact. Barnes' role in these proceedings was both central and distant. He testified when required, his voice steady, his demeanor controlled. He answered questions without embellishment, offering clarity rather than commentary. Defense attorneys attempted to undermine his credibility, portraying him as self-serving, vengeful, unreliable. Barnes did not react. He understood that his motives were irrelevant now. The information stood on its own. The psychological impact of his cooperation extended far beyond those directly implicated. Across Harlem and other cities, criminal networks took note. Barnes' case demonstrated that insulation was not absolute, that patience could be matched by authorities willing to wait just as long. It altered calculations, if only temporarily, reminding others that even the most carefully constructed systems could be penetrated from within. For those who had once benefited from the council's stability, the collapse was disorienting. The predictable routines, the quiet enforcement of rules, the sense of order, all were gone. In their place came uncertainty. Some adapted quickly, aligning themselves with new structures. Others were consumed by the chaos they had once helped suppress. Barnes observed these developments from a distance, largely isolated for his own protection. He did not celebrate the downfall of his former associates, nor did he express regret publicly. His perspective had shifted. The empire he had built was no longer something he claimed. It had become a historical fact, unfolding beyond his influence. In moments of reflection, Barnes recognized the symmetry of it all. The same discipline and structure that had enabled the council to dominate the heroin trade had also made it vulnerable once its inner workings were exposed. Efficiency cut both ways. Once law enforcement understood the system, dismantling it became a matter of execution rather than discovery. The collapse of the council marked the end of an era in Harlem's underworld. It did not bring peace or resolution. Addiction persisted. New networks formed. The demand that had fueled Barnes' rise remained unchanged. But something fundamental had shifted. The myth of invulnerability had been shattered. For Barnes himself, the aftershocks carried a different weight. His cooperation had achieved its intended effect. It had dismantled the structure that no longer protected him. It had reshaped the narrative of his life from one of silent dominance to one of decisive disclosure. But it had also ensured that he would never return to the world he once knew. In the quiet spaces where he now lived, Barnes came to terms with the finality of it all. The council was gone. The streets had moved on. His name, once spoken with awe or fear, was now referenced in court transcripts and history books. The power he had wielded was dispersed, fragmented, absorbed into a world that no longer needed him. The collapse was not marked by a single moment, but by accumulation. Each arrest, each sentence, each broken alliance added weight until the structure could no longer stand. It fell not with noise, but with exhaustion, as if the system itself had reached the end of its ability to sustain itself. And at the center of that collapse stood a paradox. The man who had built one of the most disciplined criminal enterprises in American history had also become the instrument of its destruction. Not through rage or regret, but through clarity. The aftershocks would continue for years, reshaping lives and neighborhoods. But the core truth was already settled. The empire was over, and the quiet that followed was deeper than any Barnes had known before. When Nicky Barnes emerged from the immediate aftermath of cooperation, his world had changed in ways that were subtle but absolute. The streets of Harlem, the empire he had built, the network he had governed with precision, none of it belonged to him anymore. The life he had known was gone, and in its place came a new reality, existence under witness protection. It was a reality defined by anonymity, by routine, and by the quiet knowledge that survival demanded disappearance. The king of Harlem had become a ghost. Barnes' transition into this new life was deliberate, meticulous, and, in many ways, as calculated as the empire he had once ruled. He was assigned a new identity, a new address, and a set of rules designed to shield him from those who might seek revenge. The streets that had once whispered his name now belonged to others, and he could no longer rely on recognition or fear to protect him. In many ways, this was the most complete removal of influence he had ever experienced. The initial adjustment was disorienting. Barnes had lived decades with control over his environment, over decisions, over outcomes. Witness protection stripped all of that away. He could no longer choose where he would live beyond the narrow confines of program rules. He could no longer trust anyone in the same instinctive way he once had. Every interaction was measured, every contact filtered through layers of precaution. The discipline that had kept him alive on the streets now became the foundation for survival in invisibility. Time, in this new existence, had a different texture. In Harlem, hours were filled with observation, decision-making, and management. Now, days passed with quiet regularity. Meals came and went. Appointments were scheduled. The world outside moved at its own pace, largely inaccessible. Barnes, accustomed to manipulating events from afar, now watched from a distance that was both literal and psychological. Control had been replaced with observation. Financial freedom was restricted. Most of his wealth had been seized or frozen, part of the legal consequences of cooperation and convictions against his former associates. What remained had been integrated into accounts that could be accessed only under strict oversight. Every transaction was monitored. For a man who had once moved millions with ease, this limitation was profound. It forced Barnes to live modestly, to measure actions not by desire but by necessity. Luxury, once a tool of influence, was no longer available. The psychological impact of this transformation was significant. Barnes had always defined himself through agency, the ability to shape events, direct people, and create outcomes. Now, his agency was confined to choices within a narrowly defined framework. Even daily routines were dictated externally: when to leave home, when to communicate, how to manage errands safely. Autonomy was minimal. The king had become a resident of a carefully controlled system designed to keep him invisible and alive. Social relationships were curtailed almost completely. Friends, family, and former associates were largely inaccessible. Contact was mediated by officials or avoided entirely to preserve safety. Loneliness became a constant companion. While Barnes had grown accustomed to working alone in strategy and management, this isolation was different. It was enforced externally, not chosen internally. The distance was deeper and more absolute than anything he had experienced on the streets or in prison. Communication with the outside world was carefully controlled. Letters, phone calls, and visits were monitored or limited. News arrived filtered, delayed, and partial. Barnes learned of developments in Harlem and in the criminal underworld only through indirect channels. The very world he had once influenced now moved in ways entirely beyond his reach. Watching without participating became a lesson in humility and endurance. Barnes adapted in ways that reflected his innate discipline. He established routines, structured days with small, achievable tasks, and maintained mental focus despite the absence of external control. He read extensively, keeping his mind active. He reflected on the past, not with nostalgia or regret, but with analytical detachment, examining the choices that had led him to this point. His survival depended on mental clarity as much as physical invisibility. Yet even in this controlled invisibility, danger persisted. Barnes knew that his former notoriety could attract attention, that the ghosts of his past might not respect boundaries or rules. He adhered strictly to protocol, avoided patterns that could be tracked, and maintained an awareness of his surroundings at all times. The skills that had once allowed him to manage a criminal empire now served a different purpose, preserving life through discretion. Over time, Barnes came to understand the new metrics of survival. Influence was no longer measured by money, loyalty, or territorial control. It was measured by the ability to remain unseen, to adapt to constant constraints, and to endure without error. Success in this life was quiet, almost imperceptible. It offered no prestige, no recognition, and no satisfaction derived from commanding others. Yet it preserved the most essential element, life itself. This existence also provided an unexpected perspective on his former life. Removed from the constant pressure of maintaining an empire, Barnes could observe events unfold with a clarity impossible from within power. He saw the consequences of decisions he had once made, both good and bad, and how they cascaded through networks long after he had lost control. He recognized that influence is temporary, that systems can operate independently, and that the illusion of permanence is often the most dangerous kind of confidence. The streets he had once dominated continued without him. New players rose, alliances shifted, and territories changed hands. Violence, discipline, and greed persisted, but the patterns Barnes had once enforced were gone. He observed these changes with a mixture of detachment and quiet understanding. The world he had shaped was no longer his, yet it still reflected the frameworks he had introduced, a legacy both subtle and pervasive. In the confines of witness protection, Barnes learned to measure life in smaller increments. Survival became the daily objective. Safety, mental clarity, and adherence to protocol defined each decision. Ambition, influence, and legacy were relegated to memory and reflection. The kingdom he had once ruled with quiet precision now existed only in stories, legal transcripts, and the consciousness of those who remembered. Even as he adapted, Barnes was acutely aware that this life offered no redemption in the traditional sense. His choices had consequences that could not be undone. The moral and societal impact of his actions remained intact, even if his personal survival was now secured. He existed in a space between past and present, a man invisible to the world he once commanded, yet intimately connected to its ongoing consequences. Through decades in witness protection, Barnes' life became a study in patience and restraint. Days were structured, decisions carefully measured, interactions minimized. The skills that had once allowed him to dominate a city now ensured his continued existence. Power, once external and visible, had been transformed into quiet vigilance. The king had survived, but only by disappearing completely, by trading influence for anonymity, and by accepting that life beyond the streets would never resemble the one he had built. Time has a peculiar way of reshaping narratives, particularly when it comes to figures like Nicky Barnes, whose life operated largely in shadows and whispers. Outside observers, journalists, historians, filmmakers, constructed images of him that were as much myth as fact. Headlines exaggerated influence, books amplified violence, and documentaries sometimes glossed over nuance in favor of drama. For many, Barnes became a symbol rather than a man, a cautionary tale simplified into archetypes of power, greed, and downfall. This public memory, though compelling, rarely aligned with the reality of his life, especially the quiet, methodical precision that had defined his empire. In media portrayals, Barnes was often framed as a singular, omnipotent force, an untouchable king of Harlem whose wealth and control defied comprehension. The streets, so complex and networked, were condensed into a series of anecdotes highlighting opulence, ruthlessness, and notoriety. These narratives were compelling, easy to digest, and perfect for the storytelling lens of newspapers or television. They captured imagination, but they rarely captured substance. Behind every headline lay a web of collaboration, strategy, and restraint that went largely unnoticed. Barnes himself was aware of this gap between perception and reality. Even from within witness protection, he observed how his story was told and retold. Each retelling emphasized different elements: the suits, the money, the violence, the betrayals. Few accounts acknowledged the strategic patience, the organizational discipline, or the subtle negotiation skills that allowed him to build and maintain such a system for years. The public image distilled his life into moments of spectacle, ignoring the continuous, invisible work that had been essential to his rise and survival. Historians attempting to reconstruct his life face similar challenges. Evidence is abundant, but it is filtered through legal records, media reports, and the selective testimonies of former associates. Court documents meticulously detail financial flows, communications, and organizational hierarchies, but they do so in the context of proving criminal liability, not capturing lived experience. In these documents, Barnes is often reduced to a name associated with activity, rather than a complex actor navigating social, economic, and psychological realities. Even within the streets he once controlled, memory is fragmented. Associates recall him differently, shaped by personal experience, loyalty, or resentment. Some remember him as disciplined and fair, others as ruthless and calculating. Oral histories, interviews, and memoirs contribute to a patchwork of narratives, none of which fully encapsulate the man who had existed at the center of a vast, dynamic system. The multiplicity of perspectives creates a tension between myth and reality, further complicating public understanding. Barnes' legacy, as recorded publicly, also highlights the tension between intention and impact. While he sought efficiency, discipline, and structure, the consequences of his empire were far-reaching and often destructive. Neighborhoods were destabilized, families harmed, and addiction spread widely. Public memory tends to emphasize spectacle, luxury, crime, conflict, without fully grappling with these social consequences. The reality is more complex. Barnes' operations minimized overt chaos and maintained order, yet the human cost remained undeniable. In popular culture, these tensions are magnified. Films and documentaries often dramatize interactions, highlight betrayals, or focus on extremes to capture audience attention. The seductive elements of story, wealth, risk, rebellion, dominate, leaving subtler truths in the background. Barnes' strategic intelligence, patient decision-making, and organizational skill are difficult to depict in a medium that favors action over reflection. Consequently, the man behind the empire is often obscured by the empire itself. This divergence between public memory and private reality illustrates a broader pattern in how history remembers figures involved in clandestine or criminal enterprises. Visibility is selective, shaped by those who write the stories, the narratives that attract attention, and the moral frameworks imposed by society. Actions that are quiet, methodical, or administrative rarely achieve the same dramatic weight as violence or betrayal, yet they are essential to understanding the true scope of influence. Barnes' experience underscores the complexity of reputation. On one hand, public perception elevated him to legendary status, a figure of awe and fear. On the other, it simplified his existence, flattening decades of careful strategy into anecdotes and myths. The interplay between legend and fact created a space where his life could be admired, vilified, and misunderstood simultaneously. For listeners, readers, and viewers, this presents both an opportunity and a challenge, to appreciate the human dimensions beneath the story without sacrificing engagement. Even in his later years, separated from the streets and operating under new identities, Barnes remained aware of how he was remembered. Reports, interviews, and retrospective analyses arrived filtered through layers of interpretation. He understood that the narrative surrounding him had become largely independent of reality, influenced by cultural fascination with crime, wealth, and power. In many ways, this narrative became its own kind of empire, one built not on control, but on perception. This disconnect between perception and reality has consequences beyond individual legacy. It shapes law enforcement strategies, community memory, and historical interpretation. Policymakers, historians, and criminologists often rely on public narratives when analyzing patterns of organized crime, which can lead to skewed understanding if myth is mistaken for fact. Barnes' life, therefore, serves as both a case study in operational genius and a cautionary tale about the limits of public perception. The duality of Barnes' story, what he actually did versus what people thought he did, also emphasizes the subtleties of influence. Real power is often invisible. Barnes' ability to shape outcomes, enforce discipline, and maintain cohesion relied on systems, trust, and timing rather than spectacle. Public memory, however, prizes immediacy, the flash of a suit, the story of a betrayal, the headlines that sell papers. The true mechanics of influence are rarely captured in such snapshots. Yet there is a certain poetry in this divergence. Barnes' life demonstrates that a man can shape a city, create an empire, and leave a lasting imprint without always being fully seen or understood. The gap between public memory and private reality reinforces the idea that influence is often exercised quietly, that the most effective control may leave few visible traces, and that myth can overshadow, but never fully replace, fact. Ultimately, the story of Nicky Barnes illustrates the complexity of human legacy. Public memory captures fragments, mythologizes extremes, and simplifies patterns into narratives that are easy to digest. Reality, in contrast, is nuanced, multifaceted, and resistant to compression. To understand Barnes fully, one must navigate both domains, appreciating the legend while probing the subtleties of the man whose life inspired it. In doing so, it becomes possible to reconcile the spectacle with the strategy, the myth with the truth, and to see the contours of a life defined as much by thought and discipline as by wealth and notoriety. The rise and fall of Nicky Barnes offers a study not just in criminal enterprise, but in the fragile architecture of power itself. To understand why Barnes fell quietly, it is necessary to consider the structural, personal, and environmental factors that both propelled him to the apex of Harlem's underworld and, ultimately, rendered his empire vulnerable. The narrative is one of strategy, foresight, and innovation, yet it is equally a story of limits, miscalculations, and the inevitability of external forces converging on even the most disciplined systems. Barnes' life exemplifies how control, no matter how carefully exercised, is always contingent on circumstances that extend beyond any one individual. From the beginning, Barnes exhibited traits that allowed him to rise where others failed. His intelligence was matched by patience, and his ambition was tempered by strategic restraint. Unlike many who seek notoriety through violence or spectacle, Barnes relied on structure. He understood that an empire built on impulse or intimidation was fragile. He valued organization, hierarchy, and discipline, creating systems that allowed operations to function independently of his constant presence. These principles gave him resilience and longevity, qualities rare in any environment, let alone the volatile drug trade of 1970s Harlem. The Council, his most innovative creation, exemplified this approach. By bringing together independent operators under a framework of mutual benefit, discipline, and clearly defined rules, Barnes transformed a fragmented network into a coordinated system. Profit was maximized, disputes were minimized, and violence was reduced. Barnes' genius lay not only in recognizing the opportunity for such a coalition, but in executing it with precision. The Council allowed him to exercise control indirectly, distributing authority while ensuring alignment with his strategic vision. In many ways, this system was more sustainable than traditional hierarchical gangs. It relied on incentives and shared interest rather than coercion alone. Yet the very features that made Barnes' empire effective also contained vulnerabilities. Scale introduces complexity, and complexity creates exposure. As the organization grew, so too did its footprint, financially, operationally, and socially. Assets accumulated, transactions multiplied, and more people became involved in the system. While Barnes' discipline had once ensured that distance provided safety, it also generated patterns that could be observed, analyzed, and eventually traced. The larger and more successful the operation became, the more data points existed for investigators to connect, even indirectly. This structural vulnerability was compounded by the human element. Trust, even carefully cultivated, is never absolute. The people who formed the backbone of Barnes' counsel were capable, intelligent, and ambitious. They were also susceptible to fear, self-interest, and opportunism. Over time, subtle fissures developed, jealousy over territory, resentment at perceived inequities, and anxiety about law enforcement scrutiny. Barnes had mitigated these risks through discipline and oversight, but human behavior is inherently unpredictable. Once cracks appeared, they could expand quietly, threatening the integrity of the system. Law enforcement's patience further exposed this vulnerability. For years, Barnes operated largely without direct interference, but federal investigators were methodical, meticulous, and adaptive. They shifted focus from immediate arrests to understanding the system as a whole, documenting connections, financial flows, and behaviors. The same patience that Barnes had cultivated to protect himself became, paradoxically, the window through which authorities could observe and eventually dismantle his empire. His insulation was effective against impulsive threats, but less so against deliberate, long-term scrutiny. Barnes' fall was also shaped by the tension between visibility and perception. On the one hand, he avoided overt displays of power, maintaining a low profile compared to other figures in organized crime. On the other hand, his success necessitated certain forms of visibility, wealth had to be managed, operations coordinated, and communication maintained. Over time, these practical necessities created traces that could be analyzed, patterns that could be followed. The very structures that protected him from immediate danger contributed to his exposure once law enforcement learned to interpret them. Another factor was the evolution of law enforcement and legal frameworks. Conspiracy statutes, financial tracking, and federal coordination were tools that did not exist, or were underdeveloped, when Barnes first rose to prominence. By the time the system was applied against him, authorities had the legal and technical capacity to prosecute complex organizations indirectly, using evidence that went beyond physical presence or direct participation. Barnes' discipline and distance, once protective, were insufficient against these evolving tools. On a personal level, Barnes' decision-making was also a factor. His patience and reliance on structure sometimes created a false sense of invulnerability. Confidence in his systems, though justified for many years, may have delayed adaptive responses to emerging risks. Subtle shifts in loyalty, growing attention from law enforcement, and the natural erosion of control over a large network accumulated quietly until they could no longer be mitigated. His fall was not the result of recklessness, but of inevitability meeting opportunity. The final dimension in Barnes' quiet downfall was the choice he made in cooperation with authorities. By deciding to testify against former associates, he accelerated the dismantling of the council. This action was pragmatic, ensuring personal survival, but it also exposed the full architecture of his empire. The systems that had once protected him were rendered ineffective once revealed. In this sense, the same intelligence and foresight that had built resilience now facilitated its destruction. Taken together, these elements illuminate why Barnes' story is instructive for understanding power and vulnerability. Success, no matter how disciplined or innovative, is always contingent on both internal and external factors. Human behavior, structural complexity, and environmental forces interact in ways that make permanence impossible. Barnes' genius allowed him to extend his influence longer and more effectively than most, but it could not insulate him indefinitely from the cumulative pressures of law enforcement, human unpredictability, and the structural realities of large-scale operations. The lessons of Barnes' rise and fall are manifold. Discipline and strategy can create temporary invulnerability, but they cannot eliminate risk entirely. Structure and delegation can preserve operations, but they introduce complexity that invites scrutiny. Distance can protect, but also isolates, and reliance on human networks always carries the potential for betrayal. The very qualities that allow power to consolidate also contain the seeds of exposure when circumstances shift. Ultimately, Barnes fell quietly because he operated within a system that valued stability, discretion, and patience, qualities that were mirrored by those seeking to dismantle him. His downfall was not dramatic, explosive, or sudden. It was methodical, measured, and inevitable, a reflection of both the sophistication of law enforcement and the inherent limitations of even the most carefully designed criminal enterprise. His life illustrates the paradox of power. The same strategies that enable dominance also shape vulnerability, and the most carefully constructed empires often collapse not with noise, but with the quiet alignment of forces long in motion. Barnes' story, in this context, is less a tale of moral failure or hubris than it is an examination of structural and strategic realities. It is a reminder that influence, no matter how effectively wielded, is ultimately contingent. Empires, whether lawful or illicit, rise and fall not only through external opposition but through the inherent tensions embedded within the systems themselves. Nicky Barnes' quiet fall exemplifies this principle, leaving a legacy that is as much about insight into organizational dynamics as it is about the rise and demise of a single individual. Cancel Sen. The story of Nicky Barnes' rise and fall is, at its core, a study in the mechanics of power and the fragile architecture of human ambition. To understand why he fell quietly, rather than amid spectacle or chaos, requires a careful examination of the interplay between strategy, personality, structure, and environment. Barnes' life demonstrates that even the most disciplined, intelligent, and deliberate figures are subject to forces beyond their control, and that the very qualities that create power can also harbor the seeds of vulnerability. From the earliest stages of his career, Barnes distinguished himself through patience and foresight. He was not a man who relied on impulsive violence, loud displays, or recklessness to assert control. Instead, he approached his ascent as an architect approaches a building, carefully calculating each step, anticipating potential weaknesses, and constructing systems designed for efficiency and resilience. Unlike many contemporaries, he recognized that an empire dependent on immediate visibility or brute force was inherently fragile. By emphasizing organization, delegation, and discretion, he created a network that functioned reliably without constant oversight, a network in which his influence was profound but largely invisible to outsiders. The Council, Barnes' most innovative creation, exemplified this strategic brilliance. Rather than attempting to dominate every operator in Harlem through intimidation alone, he built a coalition of independent black drug dealers, uniting them under rules of mutual benefit, discipline, and shared enforcement. This structure allowed him to consolidate power while maintaining operational flexibility, effectively reducing the risks of open conflict and internal instability. Barnes' influence was systemic. He shaped outcomes by establishing incentives and enforcing discipline indirectly, a method that minimized exposure while maximizing control. The Council was not simply a collection of individuals, it was a carefully balanced system, resilient because it distributed authority while ensuring alignment with Barnes' strategic objectives. Yet, the very qualities that enabled this resilience also created vulnerabilities. Scale, while necessary for profitability and influence, introduces complexity. Each additional member, each expanded territory, each financial transaction represents a potential point of exposure. As Barnes' empire grew, so did its footprint, not just geographically, but operationally and financially. While distance had protected him from direct involvement in day-to-day crimes, it also created patterns that could be observed and, eventually, analyzed by law enforcement. What had once been protection through invisibility became exposure through complexity. Human factors compounded these structural risks. The Council's members were intelligent, capable, and ambitious, but they were also subject to fear, greed, and self-interest. Over time, subtle fissures developed, disagreements over territory, resentment over perceived inequities, and anxiety under the growing pressure of federal scrutiny. Barnes' careful management mitigated these tensions, but human unpredictability is impossible to eliminate entirely. Even a system designed for stability can unravel if trust erodes or incentives shift, and as the network expanded, the probability of such instability increased incrementally. The evolution of law enforcement practices was another critical factor in Barnes' quiet downfall. During the early stages of his rise, Barnes' strategies of distance and discretion were highly effective against traditional police methods focused on street-level arrests and overt violence. However, federal agencies had begun to adapt, employing long-term surveillance, financial tracking, and coordination across jurisdictions to target complex criminal organizations. Barnes' insulation, once a safeguard, could not shield him from patient investigators who were willing to study patterns over years. What worked against impulsive threats was less effective against methodical, calculated pressure applied with legal and procedural precision. Visibility, even when controlled, also became a subtle liability. Barnes avoided the ostentatious displays that ruined other figures, yet his operation success necessitated certain forms of exposure. Assets had to be managed, businesses maintained, and communications conducted, creating traces that, over time, could be reconstructed. Every interaction, every transaction, every movement contributed to a cumulative footprint. While individually insignificant, these traces, when pieced together by investigators, painted a detailed picture of the network's structure and function. The very scale that reinforced his power also made him traceable. Barnes' personal approach to control, his patience, reliance on systems, and confidence in structure, also introduced risk. Over time, the very discipline that had enabled his dominance fostered a subtle sense of invulnerability. The absence of direct threats for years, combined with his systematic approach to management, may have contributed to a degree of complacency. Small deviations or cracks in loyalty were often contained rather than addressed with absolute force, and law enforcement, observing from outside, had years to patiently identify and exploit these vulnerabilities. A pivotal element in Barnes' quiet fall was his ultimate decision to cooperate with authorities. Once he recognized that the loyalty he had relied upon was eroding, and that his personal survival was at stake, he chose to testify against former associates. This action, while pragmatic, accelerated the dismantling of the council. The same structures that had protected the network now facilitated its exposure. A disciplined, organized system is highly interpretable once its inner workings are revealed. Barnes' intelligence, which had allowed him to design resilience, now ensured that law enforcement could trace operations efficiently and thoroughly. His cooperation did more than dismantle the council, it reshaped the perception of his empire. The streets of Harlem, which had once been stabilized through discipline and quiet authority, suddenly faced uncertainty. Allies and rivals alike recalibrated their understanding of loyalty, risk, and consequence. The ripple effects extended far beyond immediate arrests. The psychological impact on those who had once relied on Barnes' leadership was profound, and the vacuum created by the council's collapse invited instability, competition, and the reshuffling of influence. In examining Barnes' quiet fall, it becomes clear that the story is not one of moral failure or impulsive hubris. It is a demonstration of how structural, personal, and environmental factors converge over time. Human unpredictability, the scaling of complex systems, evolving external pressures, and the inevitability of exposure all intersected to produce an outcome that was both inevitable and controlled. Barnes' empire, meticulously built and carefully managed, succumbed not to spectacular missteps, but to the cumulative weight of factors inherent in any complex system. The lessons of Barnes' life extend beyond crime. They illustrate the paradoxical nature of power, the same attributes that create dominance, discipline, structure, foresight, also define the boundaries of vulnerability. The careful orchestration of influence can sustain control for years, but it cannot eliminate risk entirely. Systems are resilient, but not infallible. Leaders, no matter how capable, remain subject to forces beyond their direct control, and the slow erosion of human, environmental, and structural factors can culminate in a quiet yet inevitable collapse. Ultimately, Barnes fell quietly because his power was systemic rather than theatrical. There were no public shootouts, no explosive betrayals, no sudden confrontations. Instead, his decline was methodical, facilitated by the very intelligence, discipline, and foresight that had once elevated him. The quietness of his fall underscores a fundamental truth: the architecture of influence, however sophisticated, is contingent on variables that can shift subtly yet decisively. Nicky Barnes' story is, therefore, not just a chronicle of crime and consequence, but a profound study in the impermanence of human systems and the nuanced forces that shape the rise and quiet fall of power. The story of Nicky Barnes does not end with headlines, arrests, or the dismantling of his empire. It continues quietly, in the spaces between public memory and private reality, in the reflections of those who observe him from a distance, and in the lessons embedded within the arc of his life. To consider Barnes' final legacy is to look beyond the immediate drama of crime and punishment, and instead explore the complex interplay of intelligence, strategy, morality, and consequence that defined his existence. It is to understand the man behind the myth, the systems behind the wealth, and the quiet, pervasive influence that lingered long after his removal from Harlem's streets. Barnes' life illustrates the intricate mechanics of power. At the height of his empire, he was not simply a dealer or an operator. He was a strategist, a planner, a silent architect of networks that spanned neighborhoods and linked suppliers to distributors with astonishing efficiency. His council, a coalition of independent operators, represented a paradigm shift in organized crime, a move from hierarchical, violence-driven control to a system of incentives, discipline, and structured collaboration. Each decision, each rule, each carefully enforced boundary was designed to maximize profit, minimize chaos, and preserve his own insulation. The system functioned like a living organism, coordinated, responsive, and capable of operating without direct oversight from its creator. Yet this very brilliance contained the seeds of vulnerability. Complex systems are inherently difficult to maintain indefinitely. Every additional connection, every expanded territory, every financial transaction introduces potential exposure. Human behavior adds unpredictability. Loyalty is conditional. Fear is temporary. Even the most disciplined operator cannot control every variable. Barnes' genius allowed him to manage these risks effectively for years, but it could not eliminate them entirely. Over time, structural complexity and human fallibility converged with the patient strategies of law enforcement to erode the very advantages he had cultivated. The role of law enforcement in Barnes' eventual downfall is central to understanding his story. For years, he operated largely undisturbed, benefiting from discretion, discipline, and the limits of investigative capacity. But federal authorities adapted. They shifted focus from street-level activity to systemic analysis, tracing financial flows, monitoring communications, and patiently mapping relationships. They were not seeking immediate results, they were constructing a comprehensive understanding of the operation. This long-term, methodical approach mirrored Barnes' own strategic patience, and it was ultimately what allowed them to dismantle a network that had long seemed untouchable. In this sense, Barnes' rise and fall were shaped by parallel forces, his careful planning on one side, patient observation on the other, meeting quietly but decisively. Barnes' personal qualities also contributed to both his success and his quiet fall. His intelligence, foresight, and discipline allowed him to create resilience within the organization, yet the same traits fostered a sense of control that may have delayed adaptation when vulnerabilities appeared. Confidence in systems, trust in loyalty, and reliance on discretion, all central to his strength, also carried the risk of complacency. The empire he had built was robust, but it required continuous vigilance. The gradual erosion of external and internal safeguards, combined with the evolving legal environment, set the stage for the eventual dismantling of his network. Barnes' choices were deliberate and rational, yet they were made in an environment that could shift independently of his intentions. Perhaps the most dramatic, yet quietly executed, moment in Barnes' life was his decision to cooperate with law enforcement. This decision was not made lightly. For decades, he had adhered to the code of silence, understanding the risks of betrayal in a world where trust was both rare and essential. Yet the landscape had changed. The loyalty he once relied upon had eroded, legal pressure was mounting, and survival required adaptation. By choosing to provide comprehensive testimony, Barnes accelerated the collapse of the very system he had constructed, revealing its inner workings and enabling authorities to dismantle it with precision. His cooperation was not an act of impulse or desperation, it was a calculated strategy to preserve life in the face of inevitability. The consequences of this cooperation extended far beyond the immediate legal outcomes. The council he had built disintegrated. Territories shifted. Former allies re-evaluated loyalties, and a new generation of operators emerged to fill the vacuum. The social and economic structures Barnes had influenced were transformed, leaving a legacy that was both pervasive and ephemeral. He had reshaped Harlem's underworld in a way that outlasted his direct involvement, yet the power he had once wielded was no longer his to command. The quietness of his fall underscores a central truth: influence can endure, but personal authority is contingent. Barnes' life in witness protection represents a striking contrast to the empire he once governed. In this new existence, he was defined by invisibility, routine, and extreme caution. The freedom he had enjoyed, and which had been central to his strategic success, was replaced by constraints designed to preserve safety. His social interactions were limited, financial activity monitored, and every movement calculated to minimize risk. The skills that had allowed him to dominate the streets, discipline, foresight, strategic patience, were repurposed to navigate an entirely different form of survival. Power had been exchanged for preservation, influence for anonymity, and visibility for continuity of life. This transition also allowed for reflection. Removed from the immediate pressures of empire, Barnes could analyze the mechanics of his rise and fall with clarity. He could observe the consequences of his decisions, both intended and unintended, and recognize the broader social impact of his operations. Addiction, community destabilization, and the entanglement of countless individuals in criminal activity were consequences that could no longer be abstracted. The quiet life afforded him perspective that was impossible to achieve while actively managing an empire. In a sense, his existence in witness protection became a lens for understanding the true scope of the world he had once influenced. Public perception and historical memory add another layer to Barnes' legacy. Media portrayals often emphasized spectacle, wealth, luxury, and violence. Books, articles, and documentaries highlighted drama and betrayal, simplifying complex systems into digestible narratives. While these depictions captured attention, they often obscured the underlying intelligence, strategy, and discipline that had allowed Barnes to build and sustain his empire. The man behind the myth, the meticulous architect of a network that functioned with quiet efficiency, remained partially invisible to the public. His story illustrates the tension between legend and reality. The public memory often celebrates extremes while overlooking the subtleties of sustained influence. Yet, Barnes' impact cannot be measured solely by myth or media. His life offers lessons in organizational strategy, human behavior, and the dynamics of power. The Council demonstrates the effectiveness of incentive-based governance, the importance of disciplined enforcement, and the potential for non-hierarchical collaboration. His fall illustrates the limits of individual control within complex systems and the inevitability of external forces, such as law enforcement and human unpredictability, reshaping outcomes. Barnes' experience underscores that even the most intelligent, disciplined, and patient actors are subject to the constraints of the systems they create. The ethical dimensions of Barnes' story are equally complex. While he achieved remarkable organizational success, the consequences of his actions were profound and enduring. Communities were destabilized, individuals suffered addiction and loss, and families were fractured. Barnes' personal discipline and strategic intelligence did not mitigate the human cost of his enterprise. His legacy, therefore, is intertwined with both innovation and harm, demonstrating that success in illicit spheres is inseparable from moral consequence. Understanding Barnes requires grappling with these contradictions, admiration for strategic genius alongside recognition of human cost. Barnes' quiet legacy also extends to lessons in risk management and adaptability. His ability to anticipate threats, enforce discipline, and structure operations for resilience allowed him to survive longer than many contemporaries. Yet his eventual fall demonstrates that no system is invulnerable. Risks accumulate, environments change, and systems, no matter how well designed, are susceptible to external pressures and internal erosion. The intersection of strategy, timing, and external force in Barnes' life offers insights applicable beyond criminal enterprises, illustrating fundamental principles of organizational behavior and human decision-making. Ultimately, Nicky Barnes' story is one of contrasts. It is a tale of brilliance and caution, of discipline and vulnerability, of power exercised silently and influence enduring beyond presence. His rise demonstrates the potential for strategic intelligence to create remarkable outcomes. His fall, quiet and methodical, illustrates the inevitability of contingency within complex systems. His life in witness protection exemplifies the transformation from active power to survival through invisibility, and his public legacy highlights the divergence between perception and reality. The final reflection on Barnes' life is not one of simple triumph or failure. It is a meditation on the impermanence of power, the complexity of influence, and the human consequences of ambition. He achieved what few ever do. He constructed an empire of unprecedented efficiency, exercised control with remarkable patience, and influenced an entire community without overt spectacle. Yet, like all structures built by human hands, it was ultimately subject to forces beyond his control. His downfall was not violent, not chaotic, but inevitable, a quiet convergence of law, circumstance, and the limits inherent in human networks. In the end, Barnes' legacy is multifaceted. To historians and criminologists, he represents a case study in organizational strategy, risk management, and the mechanics of influence. To the public, he is a symbol of crime, ambition, and the allure of power. To communities affected by his actions, he is a figure of profound consequence, whose decisions carried real human cost. And to Barnes himself, his life is a testament to intelligence, discipline, and adaptation, a record of survival, influence, and the ultimate negotiation with forces larger than any one man. Nicky Barnes fell quietly, not because he lacked skill, courage, or intelligence, but because his story was never one of chaos, it was one of systems, structure, and inevitability. The empire he built endured only as long as its design permitted, and when confronted by forces capable of interpreting, observing, and acting with patience, the system unwound methodically. His life reminds us that power is both ephemeral and enduring. It shapes worlds even as it is subject to dissolution, and the most brilliant architecture can collapse not with fire, but with the quiet alignment of circumstances long in motion. In reflecting on Barnes' entire life, from the streets of Harlem to witness protection, the lesson is both stark and subtle. Power, intelligence, and strategic foresight can yield extraordinary outcomes, yet no system, no matter how disciplined, is immune to change. Influence can endure beyond presence, but personal authority is contingent, fragile, and ultimately subject to forces beyond the individual. Barnes' story encapsulates this duality, leaving a legacy that is simultaneously one of caution, admiration, and profound human complexity. In the final analysis, Nicky Barnes' life is a testament to the paradox of influence. The skills that create empires, discipline, patience, intelligence, and strategic vision, can also contribute to their eventual vulnerability. His rise demonstrates the heights that can be achieved through methodical planning and structural innovation. His fall, quiet and methodical, illustrates the limits of control and the inevitability of external pressures. And his legacy, observed through both myth and historical record, underscores the enduring tension between human achievement and consequence, reminding us that the echoes of power linger long after its direct exercise has ended. Barnes' quiet exit from Harlem's streets does not diminish the significance of his life, rather, it crystallizes the subtlety of his genius and the complexity of his story. His empire operated largely in shadows, yet its impact was profound. His systems were disciplined, yet vulnerable. His power was invisible, yet unmistakable. And the silence of his fall serves as a final, enduring testament. that the most enduring influence is often the one that moves quietly, shaping outcomes in ways that are felt long after the architect is gone. Nicky Barnes' story closes not with spectacle, but with reflection, a meditation on ambition, consequence, and the intricate interplay of human systems. It is a narrative that challenges simplistic notions of success and failure, illustrating that power can be both extraordinary and fragile, that intelligence can create as well as expose vulnerability, and that the most significant legacies are rarely loud, but felt deeply in the structures and communities they touch. In the end, Barnes' life is a study in contrasts, visibility and invisibility, control and vulnerability, influence and consequence, all intertwined in the quiet, deliberate rhythm that defined both his rise and his fall. This legacy, measured across decades, environments, and perspectives, ensures that Nicky Barnes is remembered not just as a figure of crime, but as a man who understood systems, discipline, and human behavior in ways that few others ever have. His empire may have been dismantled, his personal freedom constrained, and his streets long out of reach, yet the lessons embedded within his life endure. The story of Nicky Barnes is not only about crime, but about the universal dynamics of power, strategy, and the human condition, an enduring testament to the quiet architecture of influence, and the inevitability of consequence in a world that moves relentlessly forward. The quietness of his fall, the discipline of his life, and the scope of his influence collectively form a narrative that transcends crime reporting or legend. It is a story of systems, strategy, and human complexity, providing a lens through which to understand not just Nicky Barnes, but the broader principles of power and consequence. His life demonstrates that influence is rarely simple, that survival is often invisible, and that legacy is measured as much by subtlety as by spectacle. In this final reflection, we see the full arc of Barnes' story, a life defined by intelligence, discipline, and quiet authority, culminating in a fall that was as methodical and inevitable as the empire he once built. In this way, Nicky Barnes' story closes the loop, not with violence or chaos, but with clarity, consequence, and enduring insight, a reminder that power, no matter how brilliantly exercised, is always contingent, and that the echoes of strategy and influence persist long after the hand that wielded them is gone. His life remains a profound study in the limits of control, the mechanisms of organization, and the inescapable reality of human consequence, leaving a final legacy that is both cautionary and deeply instructive.